Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Wonder Woman 1984. Let's talk about it. So Wonder Woman 1984 is directed by Patty Jenkins, and this film has been long awaited. This film has had so many different release dates. Originally it was supposed to come out in June, I believe, of 2019, but it ended up being pushed and pushed until it reached the horror story that is 2020, and we all know what happened to a bunch of movie release dates this year. So I'm sure the execs at Warner Brothers and everyone involved with Wonder Woman 1984 was gutted that they pushed back the film to this horrid year, because oh my goodness, it was just the worst possible year to push back a film for. But finally we did reach a point where Warner Brothers decided that this film was coming out no matter what, and so they decided upon a new release strategy where they would be releasing the film theatrically as well as on HBO Max simultaneously. So this film is going to be landing on HBO Max on Christmas Day for US viewers, and for those of us across the pond, we were forced to have to see this film in the cinemas. But get this, there's an extra plot twist. Now, I live here in London. Now, recently the government declared that London would be made a tier 3 zone, which basically means that we have harsher COVID restrictions here because of the uptake in cases recently. And in all of the places in the country that have been declared as tier 3 zones can't have access to cinemas or to restaurants unless they're doing takeouts or anything of the sort. They're just much harsher restrictions, which basically means on the day that Wonder Woman was supposed to be released, literally on Wednesday, the government declared that no, all cinemas would have to be closed down because London was in tier 3. Imagine how upset I was. Imagine how devastated I was. Truly, this was the one film that I was looking forward to seeing in the cinema. I was like, oh my god, at least I'll be able to end the year on that note. But no, I couldn't even have this. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to see this film in London in a cinema. Guess what your girl did? Guess what your girl did? I had to travel all the way to a town outside of London to see this film. Yes, I went through all of that just to see this. Not really because it was Wonder Woman 1984, although I was very much looking forward to this film. And the only other way I'd be able to see it is in a month's time on Sky, which is just ridiculous. Anyway, not only because of that, but also because it's just been so long. It has been so long. The last time I went to the cinema was to see the Broken Hearts Gallery. I mean, it's been 3 months at this point. I really needed to go, and I was so looking forward to seeing it that I was really genuinely disappointed when the government decided to put London under tier 3. So all of that being said, I did get a chance to see this film in the cinemas as it was intended, and oh boy, do I have some thoughts on this one. But before we get into those thoughts, just a friendly little reminder that if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Without further ado, let's get into this. And actually, before we get into the review itself, just one little note: this is going to be a non-spoiler review because I know the majority of the world hasn't seen this film yet, so I'm not going to be telling you guys any spoilers at this point until we reach the point where I've given my rating, and after which I might go through a few spoiler things that I wanted to discuss. Okay, now, so without further ado, let's get into this one. So first off, right off the bat, if I was going to ask the question, was it worth me traveling halfway across the world in order to see this film? Absolutely. Abso-freaking-lutely. I had such a fun time with this one, truly. If you guys know me, you know that I'm not the biggest DC fan, okay? I don't love DC films. I don't tend to anyway. But Wonder Woman was one of the first DC films that I was like, oh, I could jive with this. This is so much fun, but it also has a nice poignant message to it. I like the characters in this world. I like the vibe of this world so much better than the dark and gritty Zack Snyderverse. And so I very much appreciated the original film, and I was looking forward to the second film. The issue with the original film for me was the last third. I've always said that I love the first 2/3 of Wonder Woman because that last third is an issue, and you'll find out if they fix that problem in the sequel later on in my review. But just know that overall, what a blast, what a joy. It was so refreshing to first of all see this film in cinema, but also just the story itself and the aesthetic of the film, the way that it embraced its 80s setting. I had such a wonderful time diving into the world of this film. And first of all, speaking of the story, I would say that the huge benefit of this film is just how well written it is. Now, I know that the story is a collaboration between Patty Jenkins herself and also Jeff Johns, and she talked about how they created this story and how, you know, Wonder Woman is dropped into a whole different decade, you know, many decades after the events of the first film. She's already used to it because she's been living throughout all of these decades, so she's seen the gradual shift in technology and culture as it's happened during this time. But it's just so fascinating to see her in a completely different decade. She's much more at ease. She has a whole life for herself. She's built a whole career for herself as well, working at the Smithsonian, and you get to see her exist in her own element this time, as opposed to the fish out of water narrative that we got in the first film, which was a nice change. Like I said, this is going to be a non-spoiler review, but just know I very much enjoyed the way that this story connected the Wonder Woman mythos with real life historical events. I love how everything just fit in. The 1980s aesthetic wasn't just an aesthetic, it was also thematically relevant. When you think about Maxwell Lord being this villain, he buys into that consumerism, that hyper-consumerism of the 1980s. You also have themes of the Cold War and government surveillance and how that plays into George Orwell's 1984, which I'm guessing the title of this film plays on. So just like in the first film, when you had that Wonder Woman mythos of Greek mythology, where you incorporated the god of war into the First World War, and I found that to be a really cool take on how to do a comic book movie. It's a similar thing here, where you have this comic book villain that's kind of enveloped in this real life historical event of the 1980s setting, but it just makes sense because of his motivations and because of what he's trying to sell to the people. If you've seen the trailers, you'll have an inkling of that. I just think it works so well together to create a really natural feeling storyline as opposed to something that is forced and mismatched. But at the end of the day, what really sells this story are the performances. The performances here are great. First of all, of course, you have Gal Gadot returning as Wonder Woman herself, and she is great here. I think that she's very much improved from her performance in the first Wonder Woman film. I've never really disliked Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman. I did think that perhaps there would have been an actress who would have suited the role better in terms of maybe her aesthetic and maybe just showing the strength of this character a bit better. I sometimes feel like Gal Gadot is a bit voguey, like she's very conscious of the camera angles, okay? But there's nothing really wrong with that, and I think this time around she very much sold me on the power of this character and also her emotions. I feel like she delivered an emotional performance where she needed to, far better than in the original film. And again, I don't think she was bad in the original film. I just think she's not exactly a thespian of the arts. So I definitely think she's been working on her acting and delivering that emotionality on screen, certainly in comparison to her original performance where she first made her appearance in Zack Snyder's Batman vs Superman. Like, absolutely, we're seeing a development here in her acting. I think that was essential this time around because a lot of the story revolves around the character of Diana, and by character I mean her personality, I mean her morals, I mean what she holds dear to her heart, that side of her character. And so Gal Gadot had to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of conveying that message through the screen, because we don't get a lot of backstory, we don't really get a lot of, you know, exploration of how she developed as this character. But as a result, because we're very much in the moment when it comes to this character, she has to deliver on all of that backstory, all of those morals that she's learned over the years on screen in that moment. But I have to say, as good as Gal Gadot is in this role, she's great with the physicality, she's great with the emotionality, you know, just she has a great screen presence to her. I have to say, this time around, she was almost overshadowed in her own film by Pedro Pascal's Maxwell Lord. Wow. Wow, wow. Talent. We've been getting a lot of Pedro Pascal lately because of course he stars in The Mandalorian as the Mandalorian himself, and he had a face reveal, a spoiler alert for The Mandalorian, he had a face reveal in last week's episode and in the finale. I'll be filming my review for Mandalorian season 2 right after this. Don't you even worry about it. But the finale is just incredible and he is incredible in it. So we've been getting a lot of Pedro Pascal, but let me tell you, in this film, he delivers. He delivers on one key aspect of this character that I can reveal without telling too much. And that is the desperation. Everything about this character is just desperation to achieve, to accomplish what he wants, his goals. Every single insecurity that this character has buried just beneath the surface, barely beneath the surface, you can see that brilliantly conveyed by Pedro Pascal's performance. He truly acted the hell out of this role. It was spectacular. And the thing is that as good as the story is, you know, there's only so much that they can do when it comes to, you know, building a character profile and going back and telling the villain's story story in that 2.5-hour limit. So he very much has to pick up the slack on that front, because we don't get a lot of Maxwell Lord's backstory here. We get it in flashes, it's very momentary and it's very rushed, but the performance just does so much to kind of support that and balance that out, so we can see again the emotion there. We can see how much what he's trying to do means to him, and how he lost his way, how he would be tempted to do the things that he does in this film because of his motivations, which again we don't get a lot of explanation for, but we can see clear as day through Pedro Pascal's performance. Brilliant. Brilliant. What else can I say? Truly, the guy is amazing. Between this and The Mandalorian, he's becoming quite the bright star. And next we have Chris Pine returning as Steve Trevor, and I also think he's great in this role as well. I was surprised to see that he's not as present in this film as I thought he would be. His role isn't as big, and if you've seen the trailers for this film, especially the many TV spots that they eventually came out with, I haven't seen much. I've seen a couple of trailers, but unfortunately a lot of his role and a lot of the best parts of his role are in those trailers, which is what I was afraid of, god damn it. But unfortunately a lot of them are, especially the funny moments that we get, and we do get a reflection of that kind of fish out of water storyline that Diana had in the previous film, this time around with Steve Trevor, who has landed himself in the middle of the 80s inexplicably, and so we do get a funny sequence there that very much mirrors what we saw in the first Wonder Woman film. But again, a lot of that is shown in the trailers, unfortunately, so there wasn't much new there. But I do think that one thing that Chris Pine very much delivers on, same with like Pedro Pascal's desperation, with Chris Pine it's wonder. It's wonder. He very much sells the wonder, no pun intended. But when this character lands in the middle of the 1980s, decades after he passed away after the events of the original film, he is just shocked. He's confused by what he finds, all these new technologies, this entirely new culture. I think that was some of my favorite moments with this character in this film, was when he was just experiencing the new world and all the new technologies that brought about advancements to, you know, flights and, you know, piloting planes, space travel even, you know, with man landing on the moon, supposedly. I'm just kidding. But the wonder that he has with all of these new discoveries is just really charming and endearing, and I think Chris Pine sells that particularly well. We'll say, unfortunately, I was less of a fan of this character when it came to the action sequences. I don't think he was as involved in them as he could have been, and I think it's because, you know, in contrast to the first film, which was centered around World War I, and he was a soldier, so he very much had an active role in those action sequences. This time around, he's very much out of his league for the most part. Like, he's just a regular old human, and he can do certain things to play a role in those action sequences at those moments, but for the most part he's kind of just standing on the side as sort of a damsel in distress, which is interesting. It's kind of like a role reversal here, because Diana is the main character in her own story, so he as a male love interest kind of takes a back seat, but even more so than he did in the original film. And I think it's because the stakes are completely different here, and also the fight sequences themselves are just completely different. A lot of them have nothing to do with what Steve Trevor as a character can offer in terms of being he's a pilot. He's a pilot, like that's what he does. And finally, I wanted to touch on Kristen Wiig's Cheetah. Now, this is a very interesting character to me, okay? I'm not very familiar with DC lore, but the first thing that I thought when I found out about this character and that she'd be in this film is why? Why would you do that to yourself? I don't understand why. You know, if you're granted any wish that you could possibly want, why would you go for being a cheetah? Like, that makes no sense to me. Like, and also when I saw the trailer later on, which I do have a trailer reaction on my channel for the later trailer that came out during the DC fandom event, but when I saw her first appearance in the trailer, I was kind of disappointed. I was a little perturbed, okay, because it felt like the CG just wasn't up to par, and I still feel that way after seeing the final product. I still feel like the CG just wasn't quite there to manifest this character in the best possible light. And speaking of light, speaking of light, so you know how I was talking about the first 2/3 of Wonder Woman 1, okay, and how in the third all of a sudden everything just came crashing down and it became a mumbo jumbo mess of CG madness that made no goddamn sense. Well, unfortunately, I would say that a similar thing happened here in the last third of this film with the fight against Cheetah. I feel like there was a very definitive moment where I turned to my brother and was like, it's become a DC film now. Like, it was a very definitive moment where all of a sudden everything became desaturated because the clouds conveniently, you know, started to gather, and all of a sudden everything just became darker. The cinematography became uglier. We had this fight against Cheetah that was very difficult to follow because everything was so dark and ugly, and Cheetah herself, in terms of her CG rendering, was just not quite there. I think they did their best, and I'm sure that they did, but unfortunately I just wasn't the biggest fan of Cheetah's final appearance. But in terms of Kristen Wiig's performance as this character, I would say that I very much enjoyed her in this role. I think she was very well cast here, because the beginning of the film does a pretty good job of setting up why she would be tempted, why she would want more for her life, why she would want something, you know, bigger than herself, because she feels so small in her own existence, because she's ignored by people, because she hasn't been able to make any meaningful connections with people. It's not really just about being the hottest girl in the room, although she does also become that, but it's also about just having no connection, just having no impact in her world, and feeling so small inside of it. And I think the film does a great job selling that as well, and also Kristen Wiig's performance does a great job selling that. But I think when she becomes Cheetah, it gets a little campy, okay? It gets a little out of hand to me, and I think the CG rendering of the character, again, just really wasn't my favourite, and the action sequences weren't my favourite because it was a whole mess happening in front of my screen. And just in general, as we're already on the topic of action sequences in this film, I would say that they were one of the weakest points for me personally. I wasn't the biggest fan of some of the action sequences here. Firstly, at the beginning of the film, you have a kind of taster of what Wonder Woman can do, because you see just how powerful Wonder Woman is. She's the daughter of Zeus, okay? She's a demigod. She has all of this power, not to mention she's been trained by the Amazonians themselves, so she already has the skill, the talent, the natural power and gifts. So to see her doing some of the things that she does in this film, she seems to be engaging in some like street level, you know, city vigilante, Spider-Man level sort of things, as opposed to tackling, you know, bigger issues that she could with her powers and her skill set. So it's a bit of a disconnect to me. There's this whole action sequence that takes place in a shopping center, for example, and I was like, why is she here? Like, why is she? I feel like she could be working on such a grander scale. Now, on the other hand, you could argue that she just doesn't want to be seen. Like, she doesn't want to tackle any huge battles or anything of the sort like she did in the first film, because now we're in the 80s, there's a lot more surveillance, we have CCTV cameras and everything. So word would quickly spread if she engaged in those matters. But at the same time, you still see those CCTV cameras in the middle of a mall. Like, in the middle of a mall, you're definitely gonna have that. And also a bunch of witnesses are there, and you're telling me that word doesn't spread that there's this magical woman with this magical lasso who's going around defeating bad guys. Like, I feel like they're taking a few liberties with that one. I think we could have seen her in a much more, you know, admirable setting that would make sense for her power set. There's also another action sequence that takes place in the White House, and she's fighting against the Secret Service, and that also felt very low level to me. Like, this very much felt like something that Daredevil or Spider-Man would fight against, not really Wonder Woman, like this demigoddess Wonder Woman. And just to end this portion of the review with some positive notes, I will say that I very much enjoyed the score here. The score of this film is fabulous, truly fabulous. It incorporates some, well, obviously the Wonder Woman theme, but also some 80s, you know, techno music, and it just creates this gorgeous orchestral sound. I just love the fact that this film unapologetically incorporates a really beautiful score. I think Hans Zimmer definitely did not phone this one in, okay? He earned that paycheck fair and square. He did the job, and I like the fact that it was, again, so unapologetically present, because in a lot of franchises these days, and just in general in a lot of films, I've talked about this recently in one of my reviews, they're kind of afraid to use a good score for some reason. It feels like scores are there as backdrops as opposed to having a presence in their own right, and I think that's unfortunate, because I like me a good musical score in a film, and I think this film very much proves that it can be supplementary and it can very much enhance what's going on screen if done right, and instead of it just feeling like emotional manipulation, it can actually feel warranted. It can make the film feel bigger than it already is. So overall, would I say that this film was worth the wait? Absolutely. I think this is such a great time. It's super fun, but it also has this great message about consumerism and also hyper surveillance and also the Cold War. Like, it has all of these messages in there. It also has a great cast leading the charge here. Pedro Pascal especially actually, listen, we're definitely on a Pedro Pascal kick right now, but I'm telling you, he steals the show in this film. He really does. Like, it's basically his film, and at some points, you know, Gal Gadot even feels like a supporting cast. Like, I don't know what to tell you. He's really that good. And so with all of that being said, I'm going to be giving Wonder Woman 1984 an 8 out of 10. So that's it for my non-spoiler review, but I did want to touch on a few spoilery aspects of this film. So for those of you who don't want to be spoiled, thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Have a great day. I'll see you in the next video. But for those of you who don't mind or have already seen the film at this point, the first thing that I wanted to touch on was Diana's powers here, because she definitely goes through some enhancements but also some downgrades, interestingly enough. Now, when we first got the inkling that Diana was losing her powers, I actually thought it was because Cheetah had wished that she would be like Diana, and because they couldn't be two of them, Cheetah was essentially kind of sucking out Diana's powers somehow. Like, I don't know I don't know what I was thinking, but I essentially thought that she was losing her powers because of Cheetah. But it turns out that she's losing them because she herself needs to make a sacrifice for wishing for Steve Trevor to return, which I like even better. I really do, because it means that she has that moment of realization that there's nothing she can do. There is no other way. She needs to relinquish that wish that she made in order to help, you know, bring about order again. After that stone and the god that made it was essentially driving people insane and having them wish all of these things, but also deteriorating society as we know it. So she makes that first step. She's the first one to relinquish her wish, and I think that was a very powerful moment. I very much enjoyed that plot twist there, and the fact that she had to make that sacrifice herself, because up until that point I couldn't help but think, like, this is a sort of character who doesn't really go through a lot of character development or a character arc, because she's essentially in the right. Like, the biggest character arc that we see her go through is at the beginning of the film when she's going through her training in Themyscira, and you have that great action sequence that the film opens up with, and she learns the importance of being truthful and telling the truth. But after that, we very much see this character as like, she's already made a thing, you know, she's already learned her lesson, she's already the good guy. But at the end there, when she has to make that sacrifice, it's like, that's that one thing the one thing that she wanted. Is just kind of heartbreaking, really. I felt for her in that moment. The one thing that she wanted, she couldn't have, because once again she had to make that sacrifice in order to save the day. Even after everything that she does, it still wasn't enough to prevent her from having to do that. I thought that was a very powerful twist. However, on the flip side, it did mean that I was left wondering what Cheetah's sacrifice was. Now, I think Diana kind of alludes to the idea that her sacrifice is her humanity, but I personally didn't feel like that was enough of a sacrifice for me personally. Like, it was very clear that she wasn't happy with the life that she had before, and so to me it made sense that she would be persuaded to just keep going, get more and more out of the stone, which later became Max Lord, and as a result she would just lose her way. Like, that made perfect sense to me, but I didn't quite understand why she would relinquish her wish, because that whole personality thing was a little bit But I will say, once again, Maxwell Lord's motivations to get the stone and to actually become the stone, and also to relinquish his wish, made perfect sense to me. Out of the two villains that we got in this film, he was done far more justice than Cheetah. And also, like I mentioned, Diana also goes through some power enhancements in this film. So she learns how to create some invisibility shield, just like Zeus did with Themyscira. She kind of takes a page out of her father's book and applies that same trick to Steve Trevor's plane. So as they're flying, radar can't detect them, which is pretty cool. It's a good way of turning this kind of cheesy, campy power set that Wonder Woman has with her invisible jet into something that was a bit more plausible and relevant, because of course they had radar tracking them as they were going to Egypt. So I like the way that they kind of tackled that, paying homage to the original character and the original cartoon, I believe, but also kind of updating it to make it seem a little less cheesy, a little less campy. And also another power set that she learned this time around was flying because up until now she's been doing this kind of leaping thing where she kind of leaps about and she's always said that, you know, flight has eluded her, and that was definitely something that Steve Trevor brought to the table. And so the fact that she was able to fly after making that ultimate sacrifice and, you know, righting the wrongs of that stone, I think that was also a very powerful moment. But I have to say I have to say personally, I felt like it looked really cheesy. Okay, it looked really cheesy when she was flying. There was something about it that didn't feel, I don't know, atmospheric enough. Like there was something off. Now, I recently rewatched Man of Steel, and seeing Superman fly, there's something about the Snyderverse where it's just so cloudy and so blue-gray anyway that it makes perfect sense. But in Wonder Woman, she's just so bright and everything just looks so much brighter and more technicolor that it looks odd when she's in flight for me personally. And also the CG was a little bit rocky. So I don't know about her flying. I would say the invisible jet scene was beautiful, especially with the fireworks, although I don't know why he would fly through fireworks. Like, that made no sense. But I think the scene itself was absolutely stunning, but the flying was, it was a bit shaky. It was a bit cheesy and it was a bit shaky. But hey, if kids are watching this, they'll have a great time with it. Now, finally, that's it from me. Now that I told you guys all my thoughts on Wonder Woman 1984, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this film down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.